In the heart of Manhattan, amidst the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, there lies a bank, one of many that guard the wealth of the city. But within its walls, hidden beneath layers of security and secrecy, something far darker waits to be discovered. The night shift is uneventful, routine, monotonous. A solitary security guard, accustomed to the quiet, keeps watch over empty halls and locked doors. The monotony is comforting, until the quiet is broken by something unexpected. The silence of the empty bank was something the guard had grown used to over time. It was almost soothing, broken only by the faint hum of air conditioning and the occasional creak of old pipes. But tonight, that comforting stillness was shattered. It started faintly, so much so that he almost thought he imagined it. A long, drawn-out hiss drifted through the air, faint and unnatural. He paused, unsure if the sound was real or just his imagination playing tricks on him. The noise grew slightly louder, carrying a strange, unplaceable quality that sent a shiver down his spine. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere below, resonating through the empty halls like an otherworldly whisper. It was not the sharp hiss of escaping steam or the hum of machinery. This was something else, organic, deliberate. The guard found himself standing still, ears straining as he tried to pinpoint its source. Gripping his flashlight tighter, he started moving cautiously down the hallway. Each step echoed softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant, haunting sound. His eyes darted to the CCTV monitors he had just been watching, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The halls were as empty and lifeless as they always were. So why did it feel like he was being watched? The polished floors reflected the flickering fluorescent lights above, adding to the surreal atmosphere. His flashlight beam cut through the dimness, illuminating small details, the edges of a locked office door, a faint smudge on the otherwise pristine walls, the gleam of brass door handles. Everything seemed normal, yet his instincts told him otherwise. As the hiss persisted, it began to shift in tone, almost as if it carried a cadence, a rhythm. It was faint, but there was a deliberate quality to it, as though something or someone was trying to communicate. The thought made his pulse quicken. Turning a corner, the sound grew marginally louder, sending a wave of unease through him. He forced himself to take deep breaths, willing his nerves to stay steady. Logic told him it could be something mundane, like a malfunctioning pipe. But deep down, a darker possibility lingered. A warning whispered in the shadows of his mind. For the first time during his long nights alone, the silence of the bank no longer felt like solitude. It felt like a void, waiting for something to emerge. Descending the stairs toward the basement, the guard felt an unease growing heavier with each step. The dimly lit stairwell stretched downward, the faint hum of the building's machinery barely audible beneath his own muffled footsteps. He had walked these stairs before, but tonight they seemed longer, as if the descent was pulling him into something far deeper than the bank's physical foundation. At the bottom, the door marked B loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the polished and professional world above. Its green metallic surface was chipped and weathered, with a large white B painted boldly in the center. He hesitated, staring at the door as a chill crawled up his spine. His hand hovered over the keyring clipped to his belt, fingers fumbling slightly as he searched for the right key. The sound of the hiss lingered, faint now but insistent, as if beckoning him closer. He found the key and fitted into the lock, the cold metal feeling heavier than usual in his hand. As the lock turned with a low click, the door creaked open, revealing the dim, damp expanse of the basement beyond. The air was different here, colder, thicker, with a faint metallic tang. The guard's flashlight swept across the space, illuminating the chipped concrete walls and pooling water on the floor. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift with a life of their own. A faint dripping sound echoed in the distance, each drop falling with an ominous regularity. Stepping inside, the guard was immediately sprayed with a fine mist of water. He recoiled, sputtering and wiping his face, his flashlight beam wavering. A burst pipe just inside the doorway hissed aggressively, spraying water in a thin, arcing stream. Relief washed over him briefly as he holstered his taser, realizing the sound that had lured him here was mundane. Still, The basement itself was anything but ordinary. The walls were cracked, with paint peeling away in long strips that revealed the gray, crumbling surface beneath. Rusty pipes snaked along the ceiling, their joints leaking droplets that fell rhythmically into the growing puddles on the floor. Farther down the hallway, the main water valve was mounted on the wall. It stood out starkly against the decrepit surroundings, its large red lever gleaming under the faint flickering light. As he moved toward it, his steps echoed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the basement. Yet something felt off. The silence here was unnatural, almost alive. He could hear faint scuttling in the distance, as though small creatures darted in and out of cracks in the walls. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of his vision, and every step felt like an intrusion into a place he did not belong. His flashlight passed over the door with the radioactive warning sign, and his breath caught. It was ajar. Just slightly, but enough to reveal a sliver of pale light spilling from within. For a moment, he froze, the weight of dread pressing down on him. That door was never supposed to be opened. Whatever lay beyond it was off-limits, forbidden, and now, impossibly, accessible. The guard stood frozen for a moment, the cold water dripping from his clothes as he stared at the door with the radioactive warning sign. Its ominous yellow and black symbol seemed to glow faintly under the flickering lights, a stark reminder of the forbidden nature of what lay beyond. That door was never supposed to be opened. It was the one thing his superiors had emphasized above all else during his training. Stay out of that room. And yet, it was ajar. His mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps a maintenance worker had forgotten to close it, though the thought seemed implausible. The building was empty during the night shift, its silence uninterrupted by human activity. He thought briefly of Mike, his predecessor, who had vanished without explanation. Had he seen this door open, had he ventured inside? A faint sound drifted through the gap in the door, a soft cacophony of voices, distant and unintelligible. It wasn't the steady hum of machinery or the hiss of escaping gas. These were voices, layered and overlapping, as if a crowd of people were gathered somewhere far below. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he strained to listen, his heartbeat quickening with every passing second. Shaking his head, he tried to focus on the task at hand. The burst pipe needed addressing, and he was wasting time standing here, letting his imagination get the better of him. With a deep breath, he turned away from the door and hurried toward the main water valve. The hallway stretched before him, narrow and damp, the walls stained with water damage and years of neglect. The valve was mounted on the wall at the end of the corridor, a large red lever that seemed out of place against the decaying surroundings. He reached it quickly, gripping the cold metal and pulling it downward. The flow of water from the burst pipe ceased with a sputtering hiss, and the sudden quiet made the eerie atmosphere of the basement even more oppressive. As he turned to head back, his flashlight beam danced across the peeling walls, the glistening puddles, and the jagged cracks in the floor. He tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it clung to him, insistent and unrelenting. Every step echoed louder than it should have, each sound amplified by the vast emptiness of the space. Then he saw it again. The door. The slight gap was unchanged, but the light spilling out seemed to pulse faintly, almost alive. The voices, too, were clearer now, though still too distant to decipher. There was a rhythm to them, a strange cadence that sent a chill down his spine. He stepped closer, his curiosity warring with his instincts. Through the gap, he could see a glint of silver tiles and a faint reflection of fluorescent lights. It didn't look like any room he had ever seen in the building before. The guard stopped a few feet away, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. He knew he should walk away, call his superiors, and let someone else deal with this. But something about the open door, the voices, and the light called to him. It was as if the basement itself was daring him to step inside and discover its secrets. The radioactive door stood before him, slightly ajar, its warning sign glowing faintly in the dim light. The guard's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the opening, a sliver of cold, otherworldly light spilling into the grimy basement hallway. Everything about this door screamed danger. Its thick steel frame, the ominous yellow and black symbol, the heavy lock designed to keep whatever was inside sealed away. Yet here it was, cracked open as though inviting him to step closer. He hesitated, his mind a battlefield of curiosity and dread. The door wasn't supposed to be open. No one was allowed inside, not even maintenance personnel. During his orientation, he'd been warned explicitly about this very spot, told to avoid it at all costs. Yet the warnings had been vague, almost dismissive. High radon levels, they said, hazardous materials. But now, looking at the faint light and hearing the eerie hum of distant voices, he wondered if those warnings had been a deliberate understatement. The voices were clearer now, an odd mix of overlapping tones that seemed to come from somewhere far below. Some were murmuring, others louder, their cadence unnatural, and their words incomprehensible. They didn't sound like people casually talking. They sounded like something rehearsed, rhythmic, like a chant or a ritual. Every hair on his body stood on end as he listened, his heart pounding louder than ever. He crept closer, almost against his will, each step feeling heavier than the last. His flashlight wavered as his hands trembled, the beam catching the polished, almost reflective tiles beyond the doorway. The air around him felt colder, denser, as though the door itself was a threshold to another world. A part of him screamed to turn around, to walk away and pretend he had never seen this. But another part, that insidious whisper of curiosity, urged him forward. What could be down there? What was the source of those voices? The thought gnawed at him, a hunger for answers that drowned out the voice of reason. Standing just inches from the door, he reached out, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the steel. The faint light seemed to pulse, matching the rhythm of the voices, as if alive. He froze, unable to take the final step forward. Instinct clawed its way back to the surface, screaming that whatever lay beyond that door was not meant for him to see. Beyond the steel door, the space opened into something that didn't belong in the basement of a bank. The guard's eyes widened as he pushed the door slightly further ajar, revealing a sight that defied explanation. A staircase descended into the depths, steep and seemingly endless, bathed in a dim, cold light that came from fluorescent tubes embedded into the ceiling. The walls lining the staircase were pristine and futuristic, covered in shimmering silver tiles that reflected the faint glow. He stepped into the room cautiously, his boots echoing against the polished floor. The air changed immediately. It was cooler here, almost sterile, and carried an odd metallic tang. The distant voices he had heard through the door grew louder now, still unintelligible but undeniably human-like in their cadence. They rose and fell, as if chanting in unison, occasionally interrupted by mechanical beeps and the faint ringing of what sounded like phones. The strange mix of sounds created a dissonant, otherworldly symphony that made his skin crawl. The stairs stretched downward into an unknown abyss, disappearing into shadow despite the faint lighting. The space seemed far too large, far too intricate to belong to the old, crumbling basement he had known. The shimmering walls glistened like they had been meticulously maintained, a stark contrast to the decay he had walked through moments ago. The air felt charged with something unexplainable, something that made his heart race and his instincts scream for him to leave. He leaned over the railing, peering into the depths, but the bottom of the staircase was nowhere in sight. Each fluorescent light hummed faintly, their cold glow enhancing the eerie stillness of the space. The voices, now slightly clearer, seemed to echo endlessly, as though the staircase was a conduit to somewhere vast and far beyond the confines of this building. Questions flooded his mind. Who had built this? What was its purpose? Why had it been hidden behind a radioactive warning sign? The sheer impossibility of it all left him rooted in place, torn between the overwhelming urge to explore and the primal fear that urged him to turn back. As he stood there, frozen on the threshold, the voices seemed to shift, growing louder and more distinct, as though aware of his presence. Something about the sound made him recoil, his grip tightening on the doorframe. The staircase was a doorway to something far beyond his understanding, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know what waited at the bottom. Standing at the threshold of the staircase, the guard's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. His mind wavered, caught between an instinctive fear and an insatiable pull to uncover what lay ahead. The voices, now louder, seemed to pulse with an almost hypnotic rhythm, echoing off the shimmering walls. Each sound felt deliberate, their strange cadence coaxing him forward, yet filling him with an unshakable dread. He reached out to grip the smooth, cold railing, the polished surface unnervingly warm to the touch. His flashlight beam swept down the staircase, catching glimmers of light reflecting off the silver-tiled walls. Still, the bottom remained out of sight, swallowed by a darkness that felt alive. The staircase seemed endless, as if it stretched far beyond the physical limits of the building above. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple as he wrestled with his thoughts. Every rational part of him screamed to turn around, to slam the door shut and run back to the safety of the control room. Yet another part, the darker voice in his mind, urged him to descend. What if the answers to the strange occurrences in the building, the voices, the mysterious warnings, the sudden disappearance of his predecessor, were down there? The unknown called to him, tantalizing and terrifying in equal measure, but fear was relentless. What if those warnings weren't exaggerations but gross understatements? He thought of the stories Mike had shared before he vanished, the haunted look in his eyes when he mentioned hearing strange noises from the basement. He thought of the stern yet cryptic instructions from his superiors, the unspoken tension whenever the topic of the basement arose. If they had gone to such lengths to keep this place hidden, there had to be a reason. His gaze flicked back to the door behind him, still slightly ajar, a path back to normalcy and safety. He could leave now, erase the footage, pretend this moment never happened. Yet, as his hand hovered over the railing, the voices grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to shift in tone, no longer indifferent but urgent, like a call or a warning. The weight of the unknown bore down on him. His hand trembled and he took a step back, the realization hitting him with the force of a tidal wave. Whatever lay at the bottom of the staircase wasn't meant for him. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, and some doors were meant to remain closed. The guard burst back into the control room, his heart hammering in his chest. His fingers fumbled with the console as he tried to steady his breathing. Every shadow in the room felt like it was moving, every hum of the monitors like the whisper of those distant voices. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had followed him back. His trembling hands flew over the keyboard, opening the security footage archives. The screen displayed a grainy image of himself stepping into the forbidden door, his silhouette disappearing into the shimmering glow beyond it. For a moment he hesitated, staring at the evidence of his trespass. It felt like staring into a crime scene, and his stomach churned with the realization of what he had seen. He selected the files and hit delete. The system hesitated, a small loading icon spinning on the screen. It felt like an eternity, the seconds dragging out as though the building itself resisted his attempt to erase his mistake. Finally, the files vanished, leaving no trace of his descent into the unknown. The room felt no safer. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the fluorescent lights set his nerves on edge. He stared at the monitors, scanning each camera feed for any sign of movement. The basement camera showed nothing but the dull green door, now closed as if nothing had ever happened. Yet the unease lingered, the cold dread settling deep in his bones. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. He'd done all he could to cover his tracks, but the voices, the staircase, the glinting silver walls, they were seared into his memory. No amount of deleting could erase what he'd seen, nor the haunting certainty that he wasn't truly alone anymore. In his modest apartment, the guard sat by the window, staring out at the city's glowing skyline. A packed suitcase rested by the door, ready to take him far away from the memories he couldn't escape. His hands trembled as he held a cup of coffee, the faint hiss of steam reminding him of that night. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss the whispers and the impossible staircase, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. The bank, the basement, that door, they weren't just part of his past. They had imprinted something dark and permanent within him.